So, Mrs. Jeeva Perumalpillai-Essex is a former development economist with nearly 40 years of experience. Oh, I have to mute somebody, so sorry. So she is a former development economist with nearly 40 years of experience addressing issues of poverty and developing sustainable programs in South Asia, East Asia, the Pacific and Africa. She has worked with multilateral financial institutions, most notably the World Bank Group and Asian Development Bank, the United Nations, and the International Finance Corporation. And Jeeva is on the board of directors of LIRNeAsia and was previously at the Institute of Regional Development and Governance at Kilinochchi. So please welcome Jeeva Perumalpillai, who happens to have got stuck in Canada, in Toronto. I'm sure I'm planning to meet her one of these days. So here we go, Mrs. Perumalpillai.
Thank you very much, Balagunan. I know you're a very good friend of my cousin. So he's talked a lot about you in Toronto. Yes, I am stranded in Toronto at this moment. So until I return, I shall continue to follow what's happening in Sri Lanka from here. And I think it's an honor for me to actually introduce this subject. And I think the name is a bit of a misnomer, animal production, because I think what Dr. Vasiharan and the Northern Provincial Council do, they do much more than just dairy development. They do a lot more in the livestock. The whole livestock industry is in their responsibility. So I'm hoping that he will sort of, elaborate on the broader scope of what the Department of Animal Production does. But I think Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in the world where they really call it animal production rather than the whole gamut of livestock development, which takes into account the poultry side as well, all the other smaller ruminants. My interest in this subject has primarily evolved from the fact that my father was actually the first Sri Lankan veterinary officer post-independence. At that time, there was no veterinary school in Sri Lanka, so he had to get educated in Calcutta and the Philippines. And he was passionate about his subject. He came back and controlled rinderpest and foot and mouth disease in the Vanni area, and was also a victim to malaria many times. So this is, I'm talking about the 1940s. And then subsequently he left Sri Lanka and went to Africa. And actually I grew up with a lot of animals, horses, donkeys, and cheetahs, to name a few. We were always surrounded by these animals, and my father tended to them. My father was also responsible for the first veterinary schools in Somalia and Afghanistan. And so that was quite something. And subsequently, when he retired in '83 and came back to Sri Lanka, he worked very closely with the National Dairy Development Board to restructure the dairy industry. And actually, he was very keen to have a dairy industry similar to what the Amul, Dr. Kurian's white revolution model in India was. And Dr. Kurian was invited many a times in the 80s to Sri Lanka to advise the government. And that was very much on the cooperative model, very successful. And many of you may know about Amul Milk, Anand Milk Union Cooperative. And it has done extremely well, not just in terms of producing and productivity of milk, but also in terms of empowering women, and it's very gender focused, as well as poverty reduction. So it's one of the things, but unfortunately the Amul model did not take off in Sri Lanka, and primarily Dr. Vasiharan may want to elaborate on why it was not so successful. Again, it was the cooperative model. And so subsequently, I also was given my keenness on the subject, I also started working a lot with livestock projects, both in Africa and Asia, when I was working with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. As many of you know, livestock, and I'm looking at the broader livestock development, but they contribute substantially to the sustainable development goals of indirectly and directly. They improve livelihoods of rural households and empower women, especially the small-scale type of activities that we are doing, and including poultry. I mean, just during this thing, I think that one of the times on the subject was that right through the war for 30, 35 years, if you look at the statistics, the one area that really, in the northern area and the eastern area, that actually increased production was in the livestock area. I was lucky enough to work with the Northern Provincial Council, and when I worked with them, I was looking at the statistics and I was amazed at the growth of the livestock, poultry and milk production during the war years compared to the other agricultural production, such as paddy, etc. So this was really something. It was really something for resilience, for households to cope with the conflict, because you had the 2 cows at the back or the 15 chooks in the backyard, and you were able to live a life. So this was very important, and it was mostly women who actually tended to sell many of these cattle and this poultry. So it has a very strong gender dimension to it. Another example of this development and practice, if you look at the Grameen Bank and the Bank of Bangladesh, they were the sort of the cornerstone, the foundation was the livestock sector that actually empowered and reduced poverty in Bangladesh. And that's why the Grameen Bank developed and the Bank. And these are some things that I think...
Volume down.
I think these are some of the things that we could very much, we're trying to do that in Sri Lanka, but I don't think we have not been that successful. Secondly, the other thing is that the nutrition is very important. Improve nutrition through livestock development. Whether it's meat, milk, or dairy products, improving children's cognitive and physical development, it is key. And I think that we forget about this nutritional impact of the livestock sector. And so a lot more emphasis needs to be given to this. It also provides access to renewable energy. We have biodiesel and animal manure. In my experience with the World Bank, in many of the rural areas, biodiesel and animal manure have been used for renewable energy and for many of the factories, etc. So especially the smallholder, electrification. So this is one area, but of course in Sri Lanka, this is not such a big issue because we have access to energy in most areas of the country. And then the resilience to climate change is just very important for households to cope with climate change. So this subject is really important, and the promotion of this subject is very important to actually adapt to climate change activities. So I can't actually, stress the importance, the development impact of the livestock development sector in Sri Lanka or in any other part of the world. In many countries in Africa, livestock is actually the backbone of all development activities. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, we still haven't got to that. I think in a lot of ways it should be a separate ministry rather than, being part of agriculture or rural development in some cases. I don't know what's going to happen in the next new government, where it will be, but I think it's very important that there's a lot more importance given to this subject. It is the livestock and primarily dairy is actually contributes 12% of agriculture GDP. And it's very similar to the fisheries sector in Sri Lanka. So it is pretty large, and it has been a growing sector. The percentage has been growing nearly about 5 to 10% every year. Again, as Dr. Tyagaraja actually mentioned, the focus has not been on dairy and milk production, but I think now there could be a sort of a much more wider, focus on poultry and eggs and all that sort of things that are very important. 22, there's lots of milk products that are imported now, and actually it contributes nearly, the last year's number was something like $312 million went into import of dairy products, primarily milk powder. And that is 22% of food and beverage imports. So in a country like Sri Lanka, where we are suffering from foreign exchange issues, I think it is critical that we do this import substitution of milk powder to domestic production and increasing productivity. And I believe the governments would start trying to close this gap between the production and consumption. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I want to give Dr. Vasiharan and all the other colleagues who will talk a lot more on the milk production and the dairy sector. But I do think, if we can give a broader view of not animal or dairy, but give a broader focus of the livestock sector, we can see where the potentials are there. I think there are certain few factors. I'll just, in closing, give a few facts on the sector that many of you may not know. One is, do you know that there is only one veterinary school in the country, and that is at Peradeniya University. So there's only one, which is a very sad fact. Still, it was established, I think, as a faculty in 1980. Before that, it was part of the medical faculty, post-independence. So, it produces only 75 graduates a year. Not enough to support the industry. The human resources is critical in this area. And apparently, I was talking to Dr. Vasiharan, 50% of them leave the country. So you're left with 30 plus. And do you know that many of these vets are also lecturers at medical faculties in anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry? In Jaffna, apparently there are about 10. So there is a great loss to the sector in human resource-wise. And I think that people don't realize this, that if it's many of the other countries, there are more vets being produced per capita to animal population. It's also much more difficult to get into veterinary school than it is to get to medical college in many of these countries. So I think that there is need to actually advocate for better and more human resources in this sector. If we want it to grow, because if you don't have the human resources, forget about increasing productivity and production in dairy or anything else. This is critical. You need to have the foundation, you need to have the people to provide extension services, advice, etc. So this is my sort of advocacy for this industry. It is a very important part for industry for development, poverty reduction, gender sensitivity, for empowering women. So I would really, really like people to actually give the support that they can, both from outside or inside, and to advocate for this industry. Thank you very much. I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Jeeva Perumalpillai. You have actually widened the scope of this webinar rather than sticking to just sticking to ice cream and milk production. You touched a very, very wide angle of what is animal production. You brought the lovely word called livestock management, which is used all over the world. You brought up this point, like the veterinary surgeons, half of them leave the country, half of them are lecturers, half of them are in the managerial positions, especially in Canada. The veterinarians are very well respected and very hard to find these veterinarians, and they're much busier than we family doctors. I think it's basically maybe due to a cultural thing. So I don't want to be a vet. I want to be a doctor. So it's the doctor image and the lawyer image and, veterinary. And we used to hear from our teachers, like the Madu makers in Tamil, like if you don't study, you have to go and, take the cattle out for the feeding.